At 0:02 on October 15, Antananarivo's power grid died, and so did the illusion of control. Andry Rajoelina's presidential palace lay silent, the man himself, nowhere to be found. Colonel Michael Randrianarina strode into the void and declared, "The people have ruled, your orders are null." Was this a coup, or the birth of a new sovereignty? If your heart demands truth, press like, stay tuned, this is just the opening act. By October 14, Madagascar was no longer calm, the island trembled like a wounded drum. Crowds filled Antananarivo from dawn till dusk, chanting, "Rajoelina must fall." The government's final command, to shoot, dissolved into silence. Colonel Michael Randrianarina and his elite CAPSAT unit lowered their weapons and sided with the people. Within hours, the palace fell, ministers vanished, and the capital burned with chants of freedom. As night fell, Andry Rajoelina fled abroad. The African Union, meeting overnight, condemned the military takeover and announced the immediate suspension of Madagascar from the bloc until constitutional order is restored. That night, Madagascar crossed a line it could never return from, and the world began to whisper, "Is this the next Sahel?" The streets of Antananarivo had turned into rivers of defiance. By early October, thousands of youth carrying red banners filled the boulevards, chanting for jobs, for water, for light, and for the end of a president they no longer recognized. They called themselves Gen Z Madagascar, the generation that had nothing left to lose. For 3 weeks, they marched under the sun and the rain, facing tear gas, rubber bullets, and silence. On October 11, everything changed. When the order came to open fire, the soldiers of the CAPSAT unit, the elite force guarding the capital, refused. Their commander, Colonel Michael Randrianarina, stood before his men and said the words that would echo through history. "We will not shoot at our own people." That single act cracked the foundations of Rajoelina's rule. By October 13, the protests were no longer protests, they were a movement. Whole districts rose up, and the police melted away. Ministers disappeared from public view. Inside the presidential palace, Rajoelina recorded a trembling video message from an undisclosed location, declaring himself still the legitimate leader of the republic, but his voice shook with fear. Then came October 14, the day history turned its page. In a desperate move, Rajoelina issued a decree dissolving parliament, hoping to stop lawmakers from voting on his impeachment. But the lawmakers defied him. In a rare show of unity, they convened under heavy tension, raised their hands, and voted overwhelmingly to remove the 51-year-old leader from office. Outside, the crowd roared, a single, unbroken sound of liberation. That afternoon, Randrianarina's convoy moved through the city. Soldiers and civilians marched side by side, waving the national flag. At 5 p.m., they reached the gates of the palace. No shots were fired. Inside, the corridors were empty, the president had fled. By nightfall, the military declared control of the country. Rajoelina, speaking from exile hours later, denounced the takeover as illegal and vowed never to resign. But his words carried no weight. The Republic had already chosen a new voice. In the capital, Randrianarina stood before the cameras. He wore a simple khaki uniform, no medals, no theatrics. He said quietly, "The army has heard the people. We will protect the nation and restore its dignity." For the first time in decades, the Malagasy people listened, and believed. Across the continent, the images spread like wildfire. From Bamako to Ouagadougou, from Niamey to N'Djamena, people whispered the same question: is Madagascar becoming the next link in the Sahel chain? Because this was not just a military event, it was an awakening. In the eyes of the young protesters, Randrianarina was not a general, he was a mirror of the Sahel's defiance, the idea that sovereignty must be reclaimed, not requested. The African Union's suspension did little to shake the island's resolve. Sanctions would come, statements would be made, but on the ground, none of that mattered. For the millions who had marched for weeks, what mattered was simple, that their voices had finally been heard. And yet, as the celebration filled the capital, Randrianarina did not smile. He knew that what begins with fire must be tempered by truth. He told the crowd that night, if we fail to build justice, this victory will mean nothing. His words fell heavy. Like a vow. Because revolutions are easy to start, but harder to sustain. And as the drums echoed across the Indian Ocean, the world began to sense it, the spirit of Sahel was no longer confined to the desert. It was crossing the sea. If you believe that Africa's heartbeat lies in the courage of its people, let your thoughts be heard, not as comments, but as conviction. Because history is listening. The night after the parliament defied Rajolina's decree, Antananarivo was unrecognizable. The air was heavy with smoke and confusion, but not fear, for the first time in years. People felt something new stirring beneath the chaos. Soldiers stood guard on the streets, not to suppress the crowd, but to keep the peace. The banners of Gen Z Madagascar fluttered in the wind. Lit by burning tires and phone lights that turned the boulevards into rivers of fire. By dawn, it was clear who held the capital. The Capsat Regiment, once the elite unit of the Presidential Guard, had taken control of every checkpoint and government building. Their commander, Colonel Michael Randrianarina, a man once branded a traitor, now stood at the center of history. His name, once whispered in military prisons, was now chanted by tens of thousands across the city. Randrianarina had been jailed in 2023, accused of plotting a coup against the very same president he now replaced. His crime? Refusing to carry out orders he deemed unconstitutional. He was a soldier who disobeyed, not for power, but for principle. And now, 2 years later, destiny had turned the wheel full circle. On the morning of October 15, 2025, the colonel appeared on national television. The image was grainy, but the words were sharp, deliberate, and steady. The armed forces of Madagascar have assumed responsibility for the nation. The republic is not dead, it is being rebuilt. There will be no repression. There will be no revenge. Behind him stood officers of various branches, army, navy, police, each wearing the flag of Madagascar stitched over their hearts. There was no pomp, no arrogance, no applause. Only the quiet weight of a country listening. Randrianarina announced the creation of the Transitional Military Council for the Reconstruction of the Republic of Madagascar. A governing body to steer the nation for no more than 18 months. He pledged to hold democratic elections within 2 years and to transfer power to a civilian government once national stability was restored. His tone was not triumphant, but solemn, as if aware that his greatest challenge was not taking power, but giving it back. Outside the broadcast studio, crowds erupted in jubilation. Young protesters waved Malagasy flags and chanted his name, Misael. Misael. For the youth of Gen Z Madagascar, he was not another general, he was a symbol. The soldier who stood with them. Not against them. The officer who refused to fire on his own people. Journalists around the world struggled to describe what was happening. The BBC called it a revolution without blood. Le Monde labeled it an African paradox. And a Kenyan commentator wrote, "For once, a coup feels like justice, not conquest." In the streets, the line between soldiers and civilians blurred. Teenagers offered bottled water to fatigued officers. Women brought food to the checkpoints. The army, once feared as an instrument of tyranny, was now seen as the guardian of the people. Still, there was tension beneath the celebration. Everyone knew that power, even in the hands of a righteous man, was a dangerous thing. But that night, hope drowned out fear. The capital became a living painting of unity, priests blessing soldiers, children drawing the flag in chalk, and music rising from every corner. At a rally outside the old Parliament building, a young activist named Safika took the microphone. Her voice cracked as she spoke. They called us dreamers. They said we were too young to change a country. But today, the soldier who once went to prison for us, now stands for us. The crowd responded with thunderous applause, and for the first time, the nation's pain began to sound like pride. Randrianarina, in his address later that night, spoke directly to them again. We are not here to rule. We are here to restore. We are soldiers, and soldiers serve. His words resonated deeply across Africa, from Bamako to Lusaka. Many drew parallels to the recent shifts in the Sahel, young officers rising not to seize power, but to reclaim sovereignty. Yet Madagascar's case was different. There was no anti-colonial rhetoric, no foreign flag burned, no political manifesto, only a promise, order without oppression. Change without chaos. Diplomats scrambled to respond. Some Western capitals hesitated to call it a coup, aware that the images on their screens contradicted the word. There was no purge. No executions, no exodus of the elite. Rajolina, though ousted, remained alive and in hiding abroad. For now, the new leadership's restraints stunned the world. In cafes and classrooms. In barracks and broadcast studios, people repeated a phrase that spread like wildfire. He disobeyed once, and saved the nation twice. For many, it felt like poetic justice. The man who had been silenced for his conscience was now the voice of the people. The soldier who was punished for defiance had become the protector of democracy. The circle of history, betrayal, punishment, redemption, had closed. But beneath the euphoria lingered a question that no one dared to ask aloud: can a revolution born from the army ever truly belong to the people? Randrianarina's answer came not in words, but in gestures. He ordered all soldiers to remove their insignia when patrolling civilian areas, to wear plain uniforms marked only with the national flag. He reopened universities, called for a general amnesty for political prisoners, and pledged that no journalist would be jailed under his rule. In the following days, international envoys arrived cautiously. The African Union maintained its suspension but noted the absence of human rights violations. The UN urged a rapid and inclusive transition. And across the continent, many Africans watched with mixed emotions, part awe, part fear, at what Madagascar had become, a mirror reflecting both the hope and the danger of change. As the sun set over Antananarivo on October 15, the crowds gathered one last time in front of the Queen's palace. The wind carried a single chant that rose above the city's rooftops.
Nier'n firanena dia awampom miaramila.
The power of a nation lies in the heart of its soldiers. And for that brief, trembling moment, it felt true. The world woke up to a new map of power. Madagascar, the island once known only for its lemurs and lost kingdoms, had just redrawn the political lines of Africa. On October 15, 2025, as Colonel Michael Randrianarina's declaration circled the globe, foreign ministries from New York to Paris scrambled to craft the right words. For some, it was a coup; for others, a revolution. For millions watching across Africa, it was something far more dangerous, a precedent. By noon, the United Nations issued its first statement. The language was cautious. The tone familiar. The Secretary-General expresses deep concern over the unconstitutional change of power in Madagascar and urges all parties to exercise restraint and return to constitutional order. The words fell like rain on dry stone. No one in Antananarivo seemed to notice. The same institution that had stayed silent through years of repression now spoke only when the people had broken their chains. On the streets, the youth mocked the phrasing, concerned, they said, but never when we were dying. Hours later, from Addis Ababa, the African Union AU convened an emergency session. Behind the closed doors of the Peace and Security Council, diplomats repeated the ritual of condemnation. In a press conference, an AU spokesperson announced, "The African Union hereby suspends the Republic of Madagascar from all its activities until constitutional order is restored." There were no tears, no applause, just the cold hum of microphones in a conference room 1,000 miles away. A young journalist covering the meeting tweeted, the AU has mastered the art of reacting. Not responding. Inside the vast marble halls of the AU headquarters, maps of the continent hung like trophies. Yet many of the flags on those maps already bore the stains of similar suspensions: Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea. The irony was not lost on anyone. As one delegate whispered off camera, "We keep suspending the symptoms, but never the disease." In contrast, Paris reacted swiftly. The French presidency, through an official communiqué, declared, "France calls for respect for the Malagasy constitution and urges dialogue for a peaceful resolution to the crisis." It was a line copied almost word for word from previous crises: Mali, Chad, Niger, a chorus of concern that had lost all music. Yet the mention of Macron's name sparked anger in the Malagasy streets. To many, it sounded less like advice and more like interference. A student at the University of Antananarivo told a local radio host, "They never cared about our hunger or our deaths. But the moment we take our destiny back, suddenly they discover democracy." That sentence spread across African social media like wildfire. Hashtags like #HandsOffMadagascar and #AfricanSpring trended across X and TikTok. In Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, murals began to appear, the image of Randrianarina painted beside Traoré, Goïta, and Tiani, the new faces of defiance. But while the continent's youth saw hope, the political elites saw contagion. Editorials in European and African papers warned of the domino effect of the Sahel reaching the Indian Ocean. Western diplomats privately referred to it as the next Sahel. Meanwhile, in Antananarivo, the mood was electric. The city had become a festival of rebirth. Teenagers painted the Malagasy flag across their faces, adding a streak of green, a color they said represented renewal. From rooftops and churches, the word Fahafahana, freedom, echoed like a new national anthem. There were no tanks rolling through the streets, no curfews, no gunfire. Soldiers walked among civilians, and children handed them flowers. It wasn't the image of a coup that the world was used to, and that was precisely what made it dangerous to the old order. At the same time, on the wide boulevards of Addis Ababa, the AU meeting continued in sterile monotony. Delegates read from pre-written notes. The cameras panned over tired faces. There was no mention of the 75% of Malagasy citizens living in poverty, no mention of the 22 protesters killed, no mention of the youth who rose without weapons. Only the same familiar phrase, condemnation of unconstitutional change. A commentator on Pan-African television said it best that night. They condemn what they cannot control. They suspend what they never supported. Across Africa, debates erupted. Some intellectuals defended the AU, arguing that laws must be upheld regardless of emotion. Others countered that a law that protects tyranny is no law at all. The question hung in the air like a storm cloud: when does legality become complicity? For the Malagasy people, those distant condemnations meant little. Their revolution was not on paper, it was in the streets. Mothers sang freedom songs that had not been heard since independence. Street artists painted murals of a soldier and a child holding hands beneath the words, "Tsaya mi New York Heracitra, not by violence." In the capital's main square, a crowd gathered around a small radio broadcasting foreign news. When they heard that the AU had suspended Madagascar, they laughed, clapped, and began to dance. To them, that suspension was not a punishment, it was liberation from hypocrisy. The young leaders of Gen Z Madagascar released a statement later that day. "We are not suspended from Africa. We are Africa. We are the proof that our generation will no longer wait for permission to be free." That message reverberated across the continent, touching the restless hearts of youth in Kinshasa, Dakar, and Lusaka. They recognized the same story in their own streets: corruption dressed as democracy. Silence disguised as stability, and the eternal waiting for help that never comes. By nightfall, major international networks framed the moment with unease. CNN called it a power shift that tests Africa's fragile balance. France 24 warned of a dangerous precedent for democratic norms. But others saw it differently. Al Jazeera simply called it a new chapter in Africa's political awakening. In one corner of a crowded cafe in downtown Antananarivo, an old veteran watched the news silently. When asked what he thought of the AU's condemnation, he smiled faintly and said, "The last time they spoke, we were still starving. Let them talk. We'll keep rebuilding." Outside, the city glowed with bonfires and flags. The revolution, for all its uncertainty, had given people something they hadn't felt in decades: ownership. The old powers could call it unconstitutional. The AU could suspend it. The UN could express concern. But the streets had already made their judgment. Some revolutions shout. This one sang. And as the night spread across the Indian Ocean, a new phrase began to surface in international headlines: one part warning, one part wonder. The next Sahel. If you have ever questioned the silence of those who preach democracy yet fear its arrival, leave your thoughts below. Because history, once again, is being written not in boardrooms, but in the streets of Africa. In the weeks that followed, Madagascar began to breathe again, cautiously, as if awakening from a long and violent dream. The soldiers of CAPSAT patrolled the streets not as conquerors, but as guardians of fragile calm. The new military council announced its guiding principle: we look to Africa now, not across the ocean. The message was unmistakable. A page had turned. In Addis Ababa, the African Union called an emergency session. The hall was filled with diplomats in suits and recycled speeches, the same language of constitutional order, dialogue, and restoration of legitimacy. But this time, something was different. The Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, did not sign the communiqué. They remained silent. Their silence heavier than any declaration. Then came the twist of history, the irony no scriptwriter could invent. In 2009, Andry Rajoelina had overthrown President Marc Ravalomanana, with the very same unit. CAPSAT, and under the watchful, approving gaze of Western partners who offered only mild concern. 16 years later, in 2025, the circle closed. CAPSAT turned its arms against Rajoelina himself. The African Union, which once legitimized his rule, was now forced to suspend him. History, with its merciless symmetry, had come full circle. The same microphones that once amplified his triumph now broadcast his downfall. The same corridors in Addis that once applauded his youthful energy now whispered about unconstitutional change. Two nights, two Madagascars, stood in haunting contrast. 2009, the night of victory, bright with fireworks and foreign cameras. 2025, the night of reckoning, silent except for the echo of footsteps leaving the palace. And in that silence, one truth emerged: the African Union was witnessing the collapse of its own creation. The order it once nurtured had devoured itself. But far away, across the continent, a new voice began to rise. The Alliance of Sahel States AES released a statement. Calm, brief, and heavy with meaning, we respect the sovereign will of the Malagasy people. Western commentators called it the next Sahel axis, a subtle warning, or perhaps an admission that Africa's center of gravity was shifting southward. The final images were poetic in their simplicity. Rajoelina in 2009, climbing the podium under spotlights. Randrian Arena in 2025, stepping down into the crowd, disappearing into the people. 16 years. 2 coups. One lesson. No one can rule a nation forever, not if the people have stopped believing. If you believe Africa is writing its own history at last. Like, comment, and subscribe, so that this flame will never fade. Dawn rises over Toamasina. A fisherman gazes at the horizon and murmurs, we've waited for this all our lives. Madagascar's dawn is not just local, it belongs to Africa. From the Sahel's deserts to the Indian Ocean's waves. One truth now unites the continent: sovereignty is not given, it is reclaimed. AES is no longer just an alliance, it is an African state of mind, a quiet revolution of dignity and self-determination. Sahel and Madagascar now form a single arc, the freedom belt of a reborn continent. As old powers debate, Africa simply moves forward. If from the sands of the Sahel to the shores of Madagascar this continent is rewriting its destiny, who dares to say Africa has not awakened? If you believe the dawn has begun, share this story, speak it aloud, let it travel. Because dawn only becomes real when the whole world can see it.